discussion where we have Francis Anderton joining us today. I see about 20 people so far logged in. We'll be taking questions after a short presentation, and we'll have plenty of time for discussion. So what I like to remind our attendees is that if you would like to ask a question, we recommend you use the Q&A box. The Q&A box is where I watch for most of the questions. And you can also thumbs up a question if you see something there that you would like answered. I like to take the questions in the order of the number of requests for that question. So the ones at the top of the list will be the first taken, and so you would click the thumbs up symbol next to the question. I also wanted to remind people that you can raise your hand. So if you raise your hand, that allows me to enable your voice if you'd like to ask Francis Anderton a question in person, and I can enable your voice and you may ask that question in person. So you can use that function within Zoom here. If you're joined on Facebook or YouTube, I will take those questions as well. Be sure to ask them early so I can catch them. We have plenty of time, as I mentioned. We should be finished by 1 p.m. It's now 12 noon, so I'll get us going here. Wanted to welcome Francis Anderton to today's program. Her new book is entitled Common Ground, Multifamily Housing in Los Angeles. Francis will be speaking for about 30 minutes. Francis Anderton has covered Los Angeles design and architecture for quite a while now, and she hosted a show on KCRW entitled Design and Architecture. So I wanted to welcome Francis to today's presentation, and we're looking forward to hearing about your new book. And I'll remind people that you can find the book on Angel City Press. And if you do end up purchasing it and reading it, we would love for you to leave a great review on the book. So let us know what you think of it. And I'm going to turn it over to Francis right now.
Well, John, thank you so much. And hello, everybody out there. I'm so thrilled to be asked to present to you all today. I'm also nervous, I should say, because I know that many of you are actually historians and you really do know a great deal about California's residential heritage, and I feel like I have a lot to learn from you all. So with great humility, I embark upon a brief presentation and then look forward to taking the questions. So as John said, I spent many years covering design and architecture, actually 30 years. I moved here in the early 90s. I'd been with a magazine called the Architectural Review in England. So add on to that, that's even more years. So I have been covering architecture and design many, many years, but primarily probably focusing on contemporary architecture. And that's why that's been my strong suit. And with this book, I guess I did sort of take a little journey down memory lane, and it's been an incredibly interesting process. Like I say, I still have much to learn. But anyway, so let's start with a picture of me. There's me with my book, Common Ground, published by Angel City Press. I'm so pleased to be part of that sort of archive of books, because they are really putting together an amazing sort of portfolio of books about LA's heritage in architecture and art and culture and photography and so on. So I've joined that library of books. But I will say, I think even Angel City Press, as with many other publishers of books that cover architecture, hadn't necessarily done too many books on multifamily housing. We've tended, in terms of media coverage of Los Angeles, be it in books or in TV shows or in style sections of magazines, we have tended to focus on the single family home that has absolutely been considered to be the most desirable form of living. I think it's fair to say in California, certainly the most remunerative, and it's culturally sort of embedded that the sort of exalted residential form is the single family home. So I pitched to them the idea of us doing something on multifamily. And why do that? Well, partly because if you live in LA and you look around, multifamily is going up all over, whether it is 5-story buildings on arterials, or it is ADUs going into the backs of behind houses that are now turning a once single family home into a little mini complex. connected or multiple dwellings on one site is where we're going right now. And much of this construction is going up at great speed and with little attention being paid to it, and a lot of complaints actually, like, oh my goodness, the scale of this stuff that's coming into our neighborhood, oh my goodness, the density, or some of the so-called type 5 construction that's going up on our arterials is kind of not necessarily all great design. Some of it is great design though, and that's where we come to this book. So anyway, that's what's going on all around us. Meanwhile, if we move on, here we go. Here's the first question: why write a book? So 30 years ago, I'm going to tell a little bit of a personal story here, and then won't spend too much with personal stuff. But anyway, 30 years ago, I moved to LA from London, and I guess I wound up living almost right away in this building here. Now, this building you're probably going to be surprised when I say to you that this is a building that was designed by Frank Gehry. It was designed by Frank Gehry back in the early 60s with a colleague of his, or a man named Feridun Ghaffari. They had been colleagues at Victor Gruen in Los Angeles, which was a massive practice in the 1950s. They built this is a 6-unit apartment building in the neighborhood of Ocean Park. It was completed in 1962, and over the years, both Feridun and Frank lived in the building, as did many of their friends. Judy Chicago lived there. Frank's shrink, Milton Wexler, lived there. Ernest Fleischman, who was the former director of the LA Phil, lived there. It became a sort of stopgap for sort of friends of Frank that were kind of in transition. So anyway, I moved into this place. I did not become one of those friends of Frank that was in transition. I wound up staying there for 3 decades. And I lived there because the place, in my view, was extremely well designed. It consists of 6 not large, relatively modest scale apartments that do not bear the hallmarks of later Frank Gehry work, much simpler, and very well planned, designed in such a way that each apartment, at least the 2 on it's a U-shaped building, and those in the I guess the stalks of the U, they actually have light. They're arranged. They have light coming in from 4 sides, which is very special for an apartment building. If you peek through, you'll see that this is our apartment. Our place has a deck. Every apartment has a deck, and then also it's a U-shaped building around a little courtyard area. Not a big courtyard at all, but it's got external staircases. We all approach our units from this external staircase, which means that we all meet each other. It's not party time like this. This photo was rather staged. It's not like this all the time, but we certainly have those casual encounters on the staircase that have created for a very pleasant way to live over the years. Along the way, I guess I formed a family. I wound up with a partner and a child, did think about moving out, going into the, proverbial starter home, and just chose, in fact, to stay. And it's near where I worked. It's near my daughter's school. There are all sorts of other reasons. It's a great neighborhood, Ocean Park. But I'm telling you all of this because I got to a certain point with my daughter in her teens where she told us that she didn't want her friends to come and visit. Well, why not? We have a lovely flat, that we live in Santa Monica. What's wrong with that? Oh, she was extremely embarrassed that we lived in an apartment while all her friends lived in the owner-occupied family home. This was very interesting to me because it came at the same time as I was working at KCRW, where we were doing a lot of reporting on the housing crisis. It's continually called a crisis. We were reporting on stories around housing. We were reporting on the ballot measures that went on the books that were trying to sort of push back against increased density. And what I always felt was the subtext to all the stories was that the housing, the multifamily, the density was kind of the problem. That it was, and forgive me if I'm using hyperbolic terms, but that somehow the multifamily was sort of the invasive species that was making life difficult for the single family neighborhoods. And I found this sort of increasingly started to sort of rubbed me up the wrong way, partly because I had my own child saying she didn't want to bring her friends to this type of building, but also because I was, as I said, following contemporary architecture, and I was seeing that many people I knew in the architecture world were doing very ingenious designs that would finding ways to navigate a whole bunch of limitations that exist, whether it's cost, whether it's code, whether it's parking, whether it's funding sources, difficulty, whether it's the complexity of trying to bring multifamily to lower rise neighborhoods. So I saw people managing to really do great work amidst the constraints, and I felt, and yet I was sort of hearing this persistent sort of multifamily seems to be the problem, and I just thought, no, I just want to sort of give props to the multifamily, and also I determined that I wanted to situate the contemporary kind of on the shoulders of the past. We certainly in LA understand that there are these moments in the past that have created great multifamily, bungalow courts. So people appreciate certain moments of multifamily, the bungalow courts, the garden apartments, and I have chapters in the book on both of those. But I wanted to just sort of try and claim almost a continuity. I wanted to just sort of argue that as long as there had been single family housing under construction in Los Angeles being experimented with in very interesting ways, so the same was happening with multifamily, sometimes even by the same architects, sometimes anonymous builders, anonymous designers. But that's what I wanted to do. I just wanted to sort of lay claim to a heritage. And believe me, there are scholars out there that have already done this, and they've done it in a far more scholarly way than I have. I absolutely submit that I am not the overarching expert. But what I did do that may add something to the story was I chose to try and tell that narrative illustrated with stories of lived experiences. So then, just in case you're wondering, here's the plan of the Gary building that we live in, and our apartment. If my my mouse seems not to be working, but if you look eyes right, you'll see that is the plan of our apartment space. You'll see we have this deck. You'll see the little courtyard in the middle. I don't know if you can see my finger moving around, but anyway, you'll see windows. Frank was really nifty at finding ways to bring in light from multiple aspects. He also has a pocket door here, a little Gregorian-like, but so the living area flows into the little sort of secondary bedroom here. It's a very, very well planned space. The dining area here looks back out onto the courtyard. Anyway, let me just, whoops. Oh, this seems not to be moving. John, for some reason, can you hear me, John?
Yes.
Hello?
Yes, I can hear you. Yeah, it's not moving.
It's not moving. What's going on here? Oh, yeah, why don't you take remote control? There we go. I approve. My mouse, I don't know what's happening here. There we go. We seem to be okay. Well, you saw the plan. There's the plan. That just for your delectation, that is Frank Gehry's mother visiting the upstairs apartment when both Frank and his sister at various times lived there, and she was visiting one of them, and his mother was apparently a force of nature in his life. So anyway, now, John, I have a little thing right in the middle of the screen saying John Haber's requesting remote control of your screen. Is there a way we can move that so I can just see? I'm trying to approve it. Oh, well. Can you all see this little factoid about numbers? It's just a quick factoid, just emphasizing the fact that as long as we've been building single family, so we've been building multifamily. That's downtown Los Angeles, 1913, already very densely packed. Why common ground? Next question. So I've determined I'll do a book on multifamily, but then with the Angel City Press came up with this title, actually, Common Ground, but they came up with that title based on what I told them I wanted the book to be about, which was the kind of multifamily that I was enjoying, the kind of multifamily which isn't a lumpen building with a double hung corridor where you just have a little warren of units that are pretty miserable, with light coming in from one aspect, no sense of sort of shared space, the dingy corridor. That to me is not good apartment living. I wanted to look at the typologies that were kind of offering the kind of experience that I was having. So this is the Schindler House, 1931, Thanksgiving. Schindler House, you could say the first duplex. Anyway, briefly, I can see time already moving on. So if we go back to, and obviously the bungalow court fits into that that story, the story of the multiple dwelling on one site, where rental, my book is primarily rental. I have some detours here and there into discussing kind of the asymmetric relationship between renter and owner, what that means, and whether or not, and ways in which that can sometimes be recalibrated. I do touch on that. It's not the primary emphasis of the book. The primary emphasis of the book is just, as I say, celebrating this fantastic residential history we have. So here, Bowen Court, 1913, built in Pasadena. It's one of the, I think, the largest extant bungalow court. There are still many the oldest, largest extant bungalow court in Pasadena. There are many others, not enough. Many of them, of course, got demolished, sadly, but this is a great one. The Heinemann brothers, 1913. You can see the streetcar lines right in front. These bungalow courts that were built then, offering up somewhat of an affordable way of living. Newcomers in Los Angeles, sometimes just for tourists, sometimes people that were staying longer. Often one of the target demographics, as I understood it from various readings, was women, single women. I completely relate to how comforting it must have been to live in a little community like this, you know, perhaps rather than in a sort of isolated home, which also was obviously on offer at the time. So and then Bowen Court today, and if you look at the difference in the landscaping, look at the just now Heinemann, as you know, highly crafted buildings. Every one of the 23 buildings, most of them dwellings. There's a sort of a tea house there as well, but most of them are dwellings. Mixture of conjoined, as in like doubles, and single little cottages, each one individualized within some unifying themes like roof lines, and then this marvelous landscaping, which today, if you go, has literally become a kind of Garden of Eden. And unfortunately, well, for good and ill, now fenced off from the street. If we go back at the time, you'll see it was you could see into this sort of semi-private or semi-public space. You know it wasn't your space, but you could certainly enjoy looking into it. Now it is in fact fenced off, so it has a greater even sense of being a kind of a secret garden. And I will say that a through line that emerged as I did the research into the spaces that wound up in the book was that what was sort of lovely about so many of these multifamily dwellings centered on shared space in LA, whether it was mine from the 60s or Bowen Court from the 19 teens, was a sense of what one interviewee I spoke with called a world within a world, a sense of being in a sort of sequestered, a secret place. And this definitely had that feeling of sort of a secret garden. It really just utterly lovely. Gibson Court, 1916, marvelous original photo showing. I don't know if these people are a family. I don't know if they're neighbors, but we see them there, you know, at the entrance to the developers, as we know, when some threw them up out of plan books and some hired architects and made them much more special. This one declares its presence, obviously, with its sign over, gives itself an archway, so it makes a sort of grander entrance. Back to 1910, and really one of the seminal, I guess, early modernist buildings, Irving Gill's F.B. Lewis Courts out in Sierra Madre, you know, way out way out east, designed intentionally actually for workers with a really generous court. The bungalow courts took all sorts of, they played with the form, let's say, so it could be a bunch of dwellings really along a pathway, facing each other across a pathway, or in this case, Irving Gill created really a large stepped plaza area, now sadly built up in the middle. It's sort of gone. They've destroyed the central plaza area, but this was actually consciously intended for low-income people, and as I understand it from Esther McCoy, it was such a hit that the rents went up. Constant challenge, of course, make something really nice and then the rents go up. So anyway, this is it today, just a corner, which I'm afraid it has been, for you preservationists, you'll probably cry. You would cry if you saw some of the ways in which this building has been disemboweled, but this little, and awful new windows put in and all sorts of things that are wrong, but it retains some moments of its early charms. Irving Gill over in my neighborhood, Ocean Park, Horatio West Court, just one unit of the 4 around this cruciform court, which, as you can see, being used by friends of one of the residents. One is on the market now for $2.5 million. And I would say it's probably about 1,000, maybe 1,200 square feet for these 2-story buildings, where Irving Gill, as you know, I'm sure, was an absolute magician with light. These buildings are like lanterns, and when you're inside on the upper floor, you've just got this light coming from all sides. All sorts of clever ways in which he borrows light down the spiral staircases. One of my themes through the book is multifamily dwelling is great when you have a combination of shared open space, private open space. You've got one, you can't have one without the other to be, I think, fully happy. And then the magic of light. You can live in 900 square feet, 1,200, 700, whatever, if the light is there and giving a spatial experience that is utterly delightful. And Horatio West Court fulfills that to the max. 1919 Irving Gill. There's the Schindler House, as I say, the ultimate or the original modernist duplex. He and his wife Pauline, and hang on, I'm going to whiz through because I've got 9 minutes till we end. So here's the Schindler House. Then we have sort of going at the same time. We have the sort of modernist architects, I guess, as well as the period revivalists, all doing their own interpretations of the courtyard dwelling that is sort of taken hold in Los Angeles. Here we have El Cabrillo by Nina and Arthur Sweeble, who were an amazingly entrepreneurial pair, built about 6 or so absolutely just magnificent courtyard buildings, mostly in what became West Hollywood, inspired by the courtyard dwellings of Andalusia. Fascinating influences make their way into Los Angeles, really, dating back to ancient civilizations and the Islamic courts of the Islamic world that then are fused into the southern Spanish architecture with the Moorish development, and then get picked up by architects in Los Angeles that are building apartments for actors, and give them essentially a stage set, but a really pretty impressive stage set. Villa d'Este by the Davis brothers, who also working at the same time as the Sweebles. The 20s, the actors coming into West Hollywood and Hollywood, Los Feliz. Absolutely loved Spanish style. You could argue people still do. This is Italian Renaissance, Spanish sort of wonderful LA fusion cuisine, as it were, fusion architecture cuisine. Villa d'Este in West Hollywood, stunning. Now these are still rentals and jolly expensive ones. Schindler Manola Court in Silver Lake. This was one that was aggregated over time. Herman Sachs, the ceramicist, I guess, brought on Schindler to build what became several units stepping down the hill around this central court in the area. Current owner is doing a restoration and adaptation job, has somewhat adapted this central terrace area, re-landscaped it. Good timing. He made this available to his tenants during the pandemic, so this became a place where people did come and sort of have that, you know, have that seclusion you needed during the pandemic, but also a place to chat with neighbors in a pod and have some lovely outdoor space. Not Richard Neutra, I believe Barbara Lamprecht is in the audience, and if she is, I just want to say thank you to Barbara, who so generously read the section that I wrote on Neutra, and it was absolutely improved with her eye and mind. And anyway, I should just say that in the book, I could have just written about hundreds of examples and had lots of little pictures trying to illustrate hundreds of examples. And I just sort of chose, just so that the book was kind of easier to look at and easier to read, to just sort of single out exemplars that illustrated a larger theme. So I do believe from all my years in radio that it's easier to make things understandable if you illustrate the general with the specific. So anyway, so when I'm talking about in the Neutra section, he's done several apartment buildings in Westwood around the time of as UCLA was taking off, but I singled out for sort of special attention the Strathmore apartments, which I truly think is just a masterpiece of, excuse me, babble. Now I'm about to have a coughing fit. So excuse me. So unit stepping up a hill, essentially a bungalow court, but Neutra sort of understood that people actually want to have, they don't want to always run into each other on a shared alley. So he actually gave them a kind of a delivery service alley that's, you can't see it, it's on the other side of these buildings. And Neutra, who, as we all know, had these ideas about a man's relationship, I guess, with nature. Barbara, if she's there, can put in the chat the correct term. I'll have to go back to my book to find the correct term. But anyway, great believer in our interrelationship, I guess, with the natural environment. Believed that we didn't need to plaster a site with building, that we needed to actually change the ratio, I guess, of building to land. So relatively speaking, there's a lot of land here given over to the landscaping, which in its time was seen by people as sort of like a moon surface because it hadn't grown up. But here, as you can see, Michael Webb, some of you might know, architecture writer, there he is on the staircase of his apartment, and you can barely see him through the jungle that has now enveloped Strathmore Apartments in Westwood Village. Absolutely marvelous. Then quick jump to 1949, and Alan Hess, refers to this as sort of Googie entering the apartment building. And this is Hollywood Riviera in West Hollywood. The swimming pool comes in, gunite, the backyards of the houses now have the gunite swimming pool, and that enters into apartment building as well. So the courtyard sort of morphs into this fun house, where people can hang out and drink Mai Tais and sit among their tiki landscaping. And, this is, we're now in the post-war era. And so the courtyard apartment building has kind of evolved. This is actually from 2012, this photo, an event that I was at Hollywood Riviera. Those of you who know the brilliant Chris Nichols will see him standing there in his blue suit. So then what does this say? More apartment. Oh, quick. I spent as little time as possible on dingbats. You sort of can't talk about LA housing without mentioning dingbats, but really, as Ken Bernstein mentioned the other day, with a dingbat, and he said in a phrase what I took a couple of pages to say, which is, with a dingbat, you get more apartment, less garden. So they're an important part of the heritage, obviously, but they definitely were an expedient mode of development. And the best you might get in dingbats might be your shared staircase and deck and corridor pathway area. That might be a place where people hang out and talk to their neighbors, but there wasn't an intentional centering on shared space. For the most part, there was some dingbats that got a bit more special and did go the extra mile, but generally they don't conform to that. Garden apartments, I don't think I need to explain to any of you what a garden apartment is, but you just know that in LA, some of them that exist. There was a good number built. LA Conservancy has done this absolutely marvelous survey into garden apartments built in the 30s, 40s, 50s by both the public sector and the private sector. The private sector got their loans guaranteed by the FHA. Public sector they wound up with having somewhat different stories. Buildings let's just say went on a somewhat different trajectory. There was all sorts of conflict, political conflict, but what was true was that some of the great architects of the time period got involved with these buildings, including Richard Neutra, Lloyd Wright, Paul Williams, Robert Alexander. The list goes on. A galaxy of talent that built these garden apartments. This is Village Green, one of the most marvelous garden apartments in Los Angeles, and unique in all of them, I think it's fair to say, in pushing the road entirely to the rim, to the perimeter of the super block. They were all these aggregated blocks into super blocks. Park La Brea comes a bit later, and very well known. 14,000 people. It's an entire community. And it's unlike the other garden apartments, adds on towers to make way for the big influx of people after the war. Park La Brea, beloved by people who lived there, still rental. Village Green became condos. Lincoln Place, LA Conservancy went to battle with the residents of Lincoln Place, which is my side of town, west side in Venice. Built in 1951, 38 acres, didn't get all the roadways to the perimeter, but it has roadways coming through that are somewhat quiet and smaller roads, and courtyard after courtyard, designed by Heth Wharton and Ralph Vaughan. Really one of my favorites. My photos doesn't do it justice because you need to do a compare and contrast. Every court was individualized. It was individualized through the window treatments, through the door treatments. Ralph Vaughan, African-American architect who had actually been at school for a while with William Pereira, wound up working for Paul Williams, then wound up, when work was short, working for MGM, partners up with Heth Wharton. They designed 2 of these garden apartments, Chase Knolls in the Valley. And I just feel that it's a feeling. I haven't been able to get a confirmation. I did call Ralph Vaughan's son, but he's elderly now and I couldn't get through to him. But I just wanted to ask, did Ralph Vaughan bring something from his time working at MGM in terms of a sense of just arrival, a sense of some level of theatricality into what was working class housing? And anyway, massive fight started in the aughts to save this by the residents, because it was bought by a developer that wanted to tear the whole thing down. What developer wouldn't look at a garden apartment development and think, that's a hell of a lot of greenery that could be built on, let's build on it? So these garden apartments find themselves struggling against those forces. Another one is Wyvenwood in Boyle Heights that's going through this. In the book, there's those stories. Then a quick leap forward, because we've got, I've already gone over time. Quick leap forward, contemporary. And I have a chapter on affordable housing in Los Angeles and market rate that I contend is doing, obviously, in a very different architectural language and at a different scale. But I contend that we are still seeing efforts to create dwellings that do offer their residents connection to shared open space. This is affordable housing by a nonprofit developer in Santa Monica. This is another nonprofit developer, Holos Communities. This is out in South LA by Lorcan O'Herlihy, very terrific contemporary architect. This is Brooks plus Scarpa, who got this year's AIA gold medal. This is housing for the formerly unhoused as well as foster kids moving out of foster care in Venice, right near where I live. They've got the raised courtyard. They've got actually it on 2 levels. This needs to be protected, but still they offer this open space. So then we jump up to, actually this is a mixture of market rate and affordable. One Santa Fe by Michael Molson, he's done the new 6th Street viaduct in LA, replacement viaduct. He's definitely a shaper of architecture in LA. So we go really big now, hundreds of units, a project with LA Metro. I'm going to zip on through. This is contemporary market rate housing in in Santa Monica by KFA, who are done lots and lots of multifamily housing. There they've sort of elevated the shared open space to the roof. All the tenants have use of this space. It's, you know, very pretty to sit up there and watch the sunset. And by the way, I should say this is on an arterial, Pico Boulevard. Another development, very, very contemporary, just finished, Office Untitled in West Hollywood. You can't see, but behind that facade, there are 3 interior courtyards. West Hollywood does try to incentivize courtyard, maintaining some level of courtyard, but this is on Fairfax, very busy arterial street. That's where the housing's going up. Striking, this is Lorcan O'Herlihy on Santa Monica Boulevard. People can sit out. He's got roof terraces. So much is happening on the roof that didn't used to happen. This is also more fun on the roof. Millennium Santa Monica by Michael Filonis. A side of his building is what's on the front cover of the book. Angel City Press found that to be a very compelling image. But the point of this image is that this is, you know, the bungalow court where people gathered in their outdoor chairs, you know, by the pathway, but now so much again happening on the roof. Quickety quick, I do have a whole strand of thought in the book about the influence of the sort of fancy apartment hotel that, you know, was a typology that came from the East. But I think this is Richard Neutra, 1927, 28. I'm just going to mention Barbara Lamprecht again. She's a consultant on this project, luxury. It was intended as luxury housing by Richard Neutra and his developer, whose name is in the book. I'm momentarily blanking. And sad hit, not so great times now, but hopefully to be redeveloped. This is Sam Respawn and Alvin Lustig. This is more motel than sort of the hotel influence. But what I say is that LA has always been a place where you've had people coming in for temporary projects, tourists, and the amenities of a hotel attached to apartment living, sort of temporary apartment living with the lobby, with the bar, with the bowling alley or whatever, all the fun stuff has definitely been a strong housing typology in Los Angeles, and it's both hotel motel kind of influences. Victor Gruen, I said that Frank and Feridun were working at Victor Gruen's together while they were working in that office. This project was underway, which is Wilshire Terrace in Westwood Village. I think it was the first high-rise apartment to break the 13-story limit. It was the second high-rise in what's known now as Condo Gulch in Westwood Village, and it was obviously inspired by Unité d'Habitation by Le Corbusier. That's who Gruen's office they were all looking at that point. So anyway, I'll quickly go on. I do a little bit about time on downtown Los Angeles and how we have the adaptive reuse ordinance. I'm sure many of you are familiar with it. It enables defunct commercial buildings to be converted into lofts as the parking mandates are taken away. And what I argue is that these don't become lofts, grungy lofts, like in Soho, New York. They become fabulous lofts because in comes the amenities of a hotel, the swimming pool, again, the bar, the lobby. We get a sort of amenities arms race. So anyway, I have a bunch on that. I go to co-living, where we really change the ratio of lived personal dwelling space to shared space. I have a bit on ADUs and the potential for the return of low rise, what I call back to the bungalow court, and the fact of the single family neighborhoods now perhaps doing what they used to call lot packing, but packing the lots with by law now mandatory by or made possible by changes in law. And then I have a bunch of places that are much more sort of organically created by just inspired individuals. So St. Elmo Village, very interesting development created by two African-American artists in the late 60s, early 70s, absolutely marvelous rental, non-profit foundation and rental community. And here two landlords who just took some buildings that they owned, a bunch of bungalows, and they wrapped all the bungalows for which they were the landlords, wrapped them in a garden, a magnificent garden. Now everybody shares the garden. It's the most magical space. I found out about it when I was working on the book, and it became my kind of North Star. Like, I just wanted to always remember that that was the kind of feeling that I wanted to be part of this book. So there's many more pictures in the book, many more examples, but I hope these have given a quick idea of what it's all about. And I'm handing back to you, John.
Thank you, Frances. I'm going to stop your screen share here and then turn it over to our audience and remind them that if you would like to ask questions, please use the Q&A box, and I'll keep an eye on that. We do have one question there that I'll start with, and it's Doug. I know you give a number of examples in your book, so maybe this would be repeating some things from your book, but Doug wants to know what sort of multifamily structures are listed on the National Register or locally designated, and he's wondering specifically, like, are there any townhouses, condos, garden apartments, or bungalow courts that are kind of nationally recognized? The one I could think of is the one that you highlight in your book on the National Historic Landmark, the garden apartments. I can't think of the name right now, but
Village Green.
Village Green.
Yes, that is registered. I think all of the Zweibel buildings, maybe except one, are on the National Register. I think Strathmore is on the National Register. If Barbara's there, she can remind me if I've just like spewed out all this information and I'm suddenly having a brain freeze. But the Neutra luxury apartments from 1928, I believe, but I think Barbara helped write.
Is that the Jardinette or?
Jardinette, thank you, Jardinette. And by the way, Jardinette means little garden in French. And so Neutra definitely had these ideas about, you know, sort of the apartments. Well, some of the apartments, not all, had these kind of cantilevered balconies, which he, in an original drawing, showed they were spilling over with plants, and so they were called the little garden. Does that start to answer your question, Doug?
I think so, yeah, and I guess I'll lead from that question into a question that I had about adaptive reuse. You sort of closed with that here, the Eastern Building in downtown LA and Broadway corridor and everything. And I'm wondering, and you mentioned the connection, Gary working for Gruen, and sort of the connection to the commercial space as well, because Gruen was known as a mall designer, right? So I'm really curious what your thoughts are on what are the new frontiers going forward in adaptive reuse? What do you see as most likely filling that niche of providing housing, multifamily housing? And which buildings do you think are the most likely candidates? You know, are they office buildings? Are they old malls? We had Alexandra Lang a few weeks ago talk about the history of the shopping mall in the U.S. and sort of it's going through its own challenging decline. Same thing with office structures in downtown areas now. So, in your opinion, where do you think the most likely next step is in terms of adaptive reuse?
Well, there's what one wants and what one thinks might actually happen. Okay, first of all, let's just give a round of applause for the Adaptive Reuse Ordinance, 1999. Hugely game-changing. You know, Ken and all the others who were part of the, I guess, what can I say? Team of forces that came together to get that passed. That has sort of single-handedly transformed downtown Los Angeles. I think there's now something like 30,000 housing units, maybe it's more than that, that resulted from the adaptive reuse ordinance. Now, I've been out of town for 4 days, and while I was out of town at actually a design conference, somebody told me that just last week that ordinance, or maybe it's another ordinance, was passed in LA that now expands the ARO. I know Ken and I have talked about that. I know that is something that Ken certainly wanted to have happen, and others do too. So I'm curious myself if that means we've gone beyond downtown Los Angeles, because ARO didn't extend all across LA. If we've gone beyond downtown Los Angeles, and if we've gone into commercial buildings. Obviously, the pandemic threw into question all this commercial square footage as office space shrank. And certainly the architecture community during the pandemic was talking about this new frontier of taking often rather freshly minted office space and turning that into residential. One of the other realms, which I didn't talk about too much in the book, just because I couldn't cover everything, is parking structures. You know, we know that a lot of buildings like Wilshire Terrace have kind of their open plaza areas sits over a parking podium. That you couldn't see it in that particular drawing of Wilshire Terrace, but behind it there's essentially what we now call kind of a parking podium. And some of those are being designed to be converted into housing. They're being consciously designed. So it'll be at such point as we really do reduce car usage, we really do shift into mass transit, we may see more housing emerging in parking structures that are perhaps 10 years old, you know. Now, about the shopping malls. Okay, so some of you online may know more about this than I do. But when I was at KCRW, I guess I sort of heard through the grapevine that John Jurdy's West Side Pavilion, his mall, the West Side Pavilion, which was booming when I moved to LA in '91, and by the way, did a book with John Jurdy about his malls. By 2020 or 2018 or whatever it was when this thing happened that I'm about to tell you, West Side Pavilion was no longer booming, and it was now looking for a new life. It's a huge mall. And I heard from various sources that the owners were thinking of turning it into housing. It would have been, in my view, perfect housing. It essentially could have been courtyard housing. That's what these malls are. But you know, that's what Alexandra's book is about, the mall as a kind of public space, the mall with these, I didn't even tell you how much, I talked a bit about sort of flying staircases in some of the contemporary multifamily, where you have a kind of a courtyard, you have roof level shared space, and then you have external bridges, you know, where people are getting to their third, fourth floor units, and the bridge itself becomes a place where people meet each other. Well, malls, they have that. So they're sort of inherently animated spaces. And so I heard that this was being floated, and I just thought, wow, that would be absolutely brilliant. Well, then guess what? I also heard that the homeowners association in the neighboring R1 areas were pushing back because they didn't want the traffic congestion. So now, again, I want to underscore that I heard it from various sources. I called the developer. I tried to find out, was this really going on? And I couldn't get confirmation. So I'm not exactly sure how far along this went. But what I would say is, it would be fantastic to turn a mall into housing. And in fact, Horton Plaza, which is John Jurdy's shopping mall in downtown San Diego, which was itself a game changer when it opened in the 1980s, that fell on hard times like malls. And I met a couple of residents from San Diego who had grown up as children with that mall. And the three of us, we floated, because I loved that mall, and the three of us floated this fantasy of like going down there and stopping, you know, the retrofit of Horton Plaza, which is being retrofitted in exactly the same way as West Side Pavilion, which is more space for tech, you know, more space for tech offices. And who knows, maybe it'll be very successful, but it seemed like those were missed opportunities. You know, you've got sort of naturally occurring courtyard housing, and as I say, a through line to pretty much everything that I was looking at. And I couldn't include everything I wanted to include, I should say, but a through line to it was this idea of within this vast, sprawling region, you have these self-contained places, these worlds within a world. And it could be like my building, 6 households. It could be Village Green with, I think it's 600. Is it 600 households or 600 people? I'll have to double check. Parc La Brea with 14,000 people. You know, there's obviously different scales, but what they all have is this sense of a little micro community, and I just think shopping malls lend themselves perfectly to that. Does that answer your question?
Absolutely. Yeah, that's fascinating. I could see a lot of similarities between Horton Plaza and some of the multifamily projects originally seen as multifamily projects, and with the public square and everything, and having the same sort of features and functions as a multifamily residence. So yeah, there's certainly fascinating stuff. I wanted to turn to sort of these utopian ideals that you know, many of these plans never came about. You highlight Chavez Ravine in your book.
Yes.
And then also Rush City Revival, which you describe as sort of a militantly rationalist mini-city. And some of them were ill-conceived, maybe. I think you may say the same thing. But others sort of resulted in good outcomes, like the Garden Cities arose from those ideals of Ebenezer Howard and some of these other thinkers earlier in the century. So I'm wondering, maybe you can describe some of the ones that never came about. And I also am thinking of the Lautner apartment, the Sheets apartment.
Oh, Sheets. Oh, yes. I should have put in a photo, shouldn't I? Yes. So, well, buy the book and you'll see the Sheets apartments. You've probably all heard of the Sheets Goldstein residence, designed by John Lautner, super famous, 1963. I think it is remarkable, you know, I mean, extraordinary sculptural triangles, massive concrete triangular forms sort of colliding into each other. Well, 10 years or just over 10 years, more like 13 years or something before he builds that, he builds the Sheets apartments in Westwood, right near the Strathmore apartments. And what I say is that you couldn't have had two more different character types. They were both essentially modernist bungalow courts. They both had units, I think is it 8 or 6 units, looking across a central pathway. They both step up the hill. They both have vegetation as absolutely enveloping the buildings, and that's where the similarities stop. I mean, the Sheets apartments, you don't know what John Lautner was drinking, but it was very strong, and it's so fantastic. The sad thing is it's in a terrible state of it's not derelict, but it's just not in a great state, because it's on a street of frat houses, and nobody will live there except other members of frats who party all the time, and so it's not in great shape. But it's you can still see its underlying mad magnificence. But anyway, what did you just say? Oh yes, about the Chavez Ravine. Okay, so Chavez Ravine by Richard Neutra and Robert Alexander, which never got built, was one of those utopian schemes. And if you want to learn more about that in greater depth, I would advise you to look up a book by friends of mine, Greg Goldin and Sam Lubell, who did an exhibition and a book called Never Built Los Angeles. And that is in there. I didn't spend too much time on it, but basically, the garden apartments, as I say, were built by either the Los Angeles Public Housing Authority, which was created in the 30s to meet this dire demand for housing for the poor, And then you have the private developers who get guaranteed loans from the FHA who build the private sector stuff. There is a racial difference. You know, the public sector housing goes for the very poor and people of color, and the private sector initially in its early days is whites only per these FHA loans. Architects get involved with both, you know, particularly Robert Alexander, who worked on Village Green, and also then was brought in by this Frank Wilkinson, who was this absolutely passionate. I think his exact title was assistant director, but he seems to have functioned like the director at Hackler, the public housing authority. Frank Wilkinson, who was grown up in Beverly Hills as a Methodist, sort of gives up on Methodism, but doesn't lose his evangelical, I guess, kind of nature, and becomes absolutely dedicated to housing the poor. It's still open to question as to whether he actually joined the Communist Party, but he certainly became very much espoused collectivist kind of principles. He was responsible for the construction of many of the public housing projects, and some of which were really well designed initially, like Nickerson Gardens by Paul Williams. Sadly, it was ill maintained, and over the years, and when it opened, it had a mix of incomes, and over time, for a bunch of reasons, that changed. So you've got this concentration of people who didn't have jobs, and so then it became kind of troubled. But later in the book, I talk about this co-living building that is actually built by a developer who grew up in Nickerson Gardens. And while he says that the place in many ways was, you know, really impoverished place to live in, an awful, but just the materials and the exposed breeze block of the units, and it's sort of miserable in ways that it shouldn't have been, because Paul Williams' design was very nice. But he did draw on the sort of community feel that the plan did kind of enable. He said it was wonderful growing up where there was enough children that you could just have both teams of a soccer game. And so he wanted to draw on some of those qualities when he then later did market rate co-living. But anyway, Chavez Ravine never got built because Frank Wilkinson went a step too far. Frank Wilkinson, you know, with the best will in the world, had this idea of building in Chavez Ravine, which was where you already had, I guess it was Mexican-American farmers and working people who actually owned little properties on the land. It was very, very rural. And Frank Wilkinson wanted to move them out, promised they could move back into this development. There was a mix of low-scale garden apartment and then these huge towers. It was a mix of European utopian modernism and the more lower-rise Ebenezer Howard, you know, sort of Garden City ideal. But it was insanely overscaled relative to anything that had been built to date. And so the forces of, you had two forces that were completely unconnected, which was the existing people living there, and then the sort of, I guess, right wing or not even necessarily right wing, but the anti-communist faction in Los Angeles, which was very strong, which just saw this as sort of crazed socialism and put up a massive fight against it and forced it to be stopped. And out of all of this, Frank Wilkinson was called to testify before the House on Un-American Activities, and he wound up in jail for refusing to state whether he was a communist or not. I mean, and then finally the site wound up being sold back to Walter O'Malley, who then built the Dodger Stadium. It's a sort of tragic story that just sort of encapsulated all the pressures of the time. And so that was like the end of the road for utopian modernism. And so that's why the affordable housing of today is kind of fascinating, because it's not happening on the scale of those buildings. It's project by project by project, you know, and the non-profit developers who are trying to build housing for the people at sort of near the poverty line, or people that cannot afford LA rents, basically, and people, sometimes people with mental health issues. They are jumping through such convoluted hoops to get these places financed and built. And, you know, some of them I think are doing great projects, you know, despite that. And I see we have 1 minute to go. So
I do
so
have
I have a
closing. Well, I do have a closing question for you, and I think
yeah,
I had never known about Nickerson Gardens until reading your book, and just that whole history of the public housing in the Los Angeles area, and you know, it struck me, you know, that the privately developed ones survived, but the public housing largely is gone, you know, now. But I guess my closing question really is about the fact you mentioned this statistic earlier in your book is there's 500,000 single family residences, at least as of 2020, and 600,000 people living in apartments in the Los Angeles region. But in historic preservation and generally in our sort of understanding of these master architects, we look at the private homes, we look at the single family residences, and a lot of the historic districts are based around single family. But what you highlight in your book is that there are these amazing examples that are historic structures that can kind of inspire us to look at new models of doing housing. So maybe you could close with just kind of telling us what you think people should get out of your book, if anything, when it comes to looking in a new direction with historic preservation.
well, I think that we have to be realistic about the future and recognize that much of LA has been built up, so there really isn't room to sort of perpetuate the single family house model, leaving aside issues of climate change and the necessity of building near mass transit and all of that. So I think the reality is that more and more people are going to be in multifamily housing. So therefore, I think we've just got to use the carrot approach rather than the stick approach to saying you've got to have this density coming into your neighborhood. You know, we've had this big push for these HPOZs to preserve sort of the, you know, the character of many neighborhoods, and what that really also entails is keeping them very, very low rise.